At Sunset Manor, 83-year-old Iyana Swift was preparing for her second wedding when preparations took a shocking turn. Her vintage dress lay destroyed, slashed by jealous hands. For 60 years, she'd endured her sister Dolores' cruelty while keeping a devastating secret about infidelity. The quiet librarian's revenge came through methodical phone calls, exposing her brother-in-law's decades-old affair. What began as wedding sabotage became nuclear family warfare, with one woman's calculated response destroying 3 generations of carefully constructed lies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Iyana Swift adjusted the pearl necklace at her throat for the 3rd time in 10 minutes, her reflection in the vanity mirror showing a woman she barely recognized. At 83, she had never expected to be preparing for a wedding again. The soft morning light filtering through her apartment window at Sunset Manor retirement community caught the silver in her carefully styled hair, and for once, she allowed herself to feel beautiful. "You're glowing," Harold said from the doorway, his voice carrying the same gentle warmth that had first drawn her to him 18 months ago in the community's book club. At 85, Harold Brennan moved with the careful dignity of a man who had learned to treasure each day, each moment of connection. His eyes, still sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, held the kind of appreciation that had been absent from Iyana's life for far too long. She turned from the mirror, smoothing her navy dress, the one she'd chosen for the rehearsal dinner. Tomorrow's wedding dress hung in the closet, wrapped in protective plastic like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. "I feel ridiculous being this nervous," she admitted, though her smile betrayed her joy. Harold crossed the small room and took her hands, his touch steady despite the slight tremor of age. "Nervous is good. It means this matters." He paused, studying her face with the intensity that had first made her feel truly seen. "You know what I love most about you, Iyana? You never pretended to be anything other than exactly who you are." The irony of his words would have been amusing if it weren't so painful. Iyana had spent 70 years being exactly who her family expected her to be. The quiet sister, the one who didn't cause trouble, the one who faded into the background while others shone. But Harold saw something different. Something that made her feel like she might have been worth noticing all along. A sharp knock interrupted the moment, followed by a voice that could command attention from 3 rooms away. "Iyana, are you decent? I'm coming in." The door burst open before Iyana could respond, and Dolores Swift Montgomery swept into the room like a force of nature wrapped in designer clothing. At 79, Dolores had maintained the kind of carefully constructed elegance that required daily effort and considerable expense. Her silver hair was professionally styled, her makeup flawless, her pale blue suit clearly expensive. She moved with the confidence of a woman who had never doubted her place at the center of any room. "Oh, don't you both look precious?" Dolores announced, though her eyes barely registered Harold's presence before focusing entirely on her sister. "I simply had to see you before tonight's dinner. The whole family is so excited about this little wedding of yours." Iyana felt the familiar shrinking sensation she'd experienced in Dolores' presence since childhood. Her sister had a gift for making the word little sound both affectionate and dismissive, a skill she'd perfected over 70 decades of being the family's undisputed star. "It's lovely to see you again, Dolores," Harold said with a tone carrying a subtle coolness that Iyana recognized, but hoped her sister wouldn't notice. Harold had witnessed enough family dinners to understand the dynamics at play, even if he was too polite to comment directly. "Professor Brennan," Dolores replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I hope you're prepared for tonight. Margaret is bringing the whole clan. You'll finally get to meet everyone who matters." The phrase hung in the air like a small cruelty, everyone who matters, as if Iyana, who'd known these people her entire life, somehow existed outside that circle. Harold's hand found Iyana's, a silent reminder of his presence and support. I'm looking forward to celebrating with people who care about Iyana's happiness. Something flickered across Dolores's face, perhaps surprise at being challenged so gently but firmly. She recovered quickly, her smile brightening to the wattage that had charmed 3 generations of the Swift family. Of course, that's all any of us want. Iyana deserves to be happy. She moved closer to examine the small silver-framed photographs on Iyana's dresser, pictures of Harold, of their book club friends, of quiet moments that had meant everything to someone who had learned to find joy in small things. But I must say I never expected, well, at our age, who could have predicted such a development? There it was again, the careful insertion of doubt wrapped in familial concern. Dolores had always possessed an almost supernatural ability to undermine without appearing to attack, to question without seeming unkind. Love doesn't follow schedules, Iyana said quietly, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Dolores turned, her expression shifting to something that might have been genuine affection if it hadn't been tinged with something else, something that looked uncomfortably like pity. Of course not, dear. And after 55 years with Gerald, you certainly deserve whatever happiness you can find. The reference to her late husband felt like a small slap. Gerald was a good man, steady and kind, but their marriage had been built on compatibility rather than passion. Harold represented something different, a connection that made her feel alive in ways she'd almost forgotten were possible. We should head down to the dining room, Harold suggested, his voice carrying a subtle warning that this conversation had gone far enough. Emily Rodriguez was hoping to speak with you before dinner. Dolores's laugh tinkled like expensive crystal. Oh, Emily, such a sweet woman. It's wonderful that you found friendship here, Iyana. Community is so important at our age. As they prepared to leave, Iyana caught sight of herself in the mirror again. The confident woman from 10 minutes ago had faded, replaced by someone who looked uncertain, diminished. Dolores had accomplished in 5 minutes what she had been doing for 70 decades, making Iyana question her own worth, her own choices, her own right to happiness. Walking down the hallway toward the community center, Iyana found herself remembering another mirror, another moment of feeling beautiful that had been shattered by her sister's particular brand of loving cruelty. She had been 9 years old, wearing her first party dress, excited about a school dance. Dolores, 7, and already possessed of an uncanny ability to identify weakness, had looked at her with that same mixture of affection and pity. Oh, Iyana, that dress almost makes you look pretty. The memory surfaced with startling clarity, carrying with it the familiar ache of being found wanting by the one person whose approval she had desperately craved. Even now, preparing for what should have been the happiest day of her later life, Dolores could resurrect that 9-year-old girl who had learned to expect disappointment disguised as love. But Harold's hand in hers anchored her to the present, to the reality of being valued and cherished by someone who saw her clearly and loved what he saw. Tomorrow, she would marry a man who made her laugh, who listened to her thoughts as if they mattered, who had given her back a piece of herself she thought was lost forever. She just had to survive tonight's dinner first, and the careful maneuvering that would be required to maintain peace while her sister held court at what was supposed to be Iyana's celebration. As they approached the dining room, where voices and laughter already spilled out into the hallway, Iyana steeled herself for an evening of performance, playing the grateful sister, the surprised bride, the woman who couldn't quite believe her good fortune. If only she could silence the voice in her head that whispered, Dolores might be right. If only she could forget that tomorrow's wedding dress hanging in her closet represented not just love found, but decades of love denied, overlooked, and dismissed by the very people who should have celebrated her happiness above all else. Harold squeezed her hand gently as they reached the dining room threshold. In his touch, she found the strength to lift her chin and step forward into whatever the evening would bring, carrying with her the fragile hope that some wounds could heal, some chances could be taken, and some love could be strong enough to overcome a lifetime of careful cruelties delivered with a smile. The dining room at Sunset Manor had been transformed for the pre-wedding celebration, with white linens and small arrangements. David Montgomery appeared at Margaret's elbow, and Iyana felt a flutter of relief. At 45, Dolores' youngest son had inherited his father's height and his grandmother's gentle eyes. Unlike his sister, David had always treated Iyana with genuine warmth, perhaps because his work as a counselor had taught him to see past surface presentations to the person beneath. "Aunt Iyana," he said, embracing her with real affection. "You look radiant. Harold, good to see you again, sir." "David," Harold responded, his posture relaxing slightly. "How's the practice going?" "Busy as always. People don't seem to run out of things to work through." David's smile carried a hint of irony that suggested he was well aware of the family dynamics playing out around them. "I'm looking forward to tomorrow. It's not often we get to celebrate new beginnings." Dolores materialized beside them with the fluid grace of someone who had never met a conversation she couldn't dominate. "David, darling, tell Professor Brennan about that conference you attended, the one about late life transitions. I'm sure he'd find it fascinating." The suggestion carried the subtle implication that Harold's relationship with Iyana was more pathology than romance, something to be understood through the lens of geriatric psychology rather than celebrated as love found. "Actually," David said carefully, "the research shows that meaningful relationships formed later in life often have a depth and authenticity that younger people haven't yet developed, less game-playing, more genuine connection." Iyana caught the slight tightening around Dolores' eyes at this gentle correction of her narrative. Her sister had always struggled when her pronouncements were challenged, even indirectly. "Of course," Dolores recovered smoothly. "I simply meant that your professional perspective might be illuminating." Rose Chen approached their group, her expression carrying the diplomatic neutrality of someone who had witnessed decades of family dynamics within the community walls. "Mrs. Swift, if you'd like to see the flowers for tomorrow's ceremony, they've just arrived." As they moved toward the community center's small chapel, Iyana found herself walking beside Emily Rodriguez, whose presence always brought a sense of calm perspective to any situation. At 81, Emily possessed the kind of hard-won wisdom that came from years of listening to other people's secrets as a therapist, combined with the gentle honesty of someone who had learned to value authenticity rather than diplomacy. "How are you holding up?" Emily asked quietly, as they trailed behind the main group. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong. It feels too good to be real." Emily's weathered hand found her arm. "Happiness doesn't require justification, dear. You don't need permission to be joyful." They entered the chapel where white roses and baby's breath had been arranged with simple elegance, but Iyana's attention was drawn to the way Dolores was examining the space, her calculating gaze taking in every detail with the intensity of someone cataloging evidence for future use. "Lovely," Dolores pronounced. "Very intimate, though I suppose with such a small guest list, anything larger would feel empty." Another diminishment delivered with surgical precision. Iyana and Harold had chosen to keep the ceremony small. Close friends from the community, Harold's adult daughter, who was flying in from Oregon, and immediate family. It was exactly what they wanted, but under Dolores' scrutiny, it felt suddenly inadequate. "Small can be beautiful," Rose Chen observed diplomatically. Oh, absolutely, Margaret chimed in. Some of the most meaningful ceremonies are the simplest ones. Though I must say, Aunt Iyana, I was surprised you chose not to include Uncle Gerald's family. The Mitchells have always been so fond of you. The suggestion carried multiple layers of subtle criticism, that Iyana was somehow betraying her first husband's memory, that she was excluding people who mattered, that her judgment about her own wedding might be questionable. Margaret had mastered her mother's technique of emotional manipulation disguised as loving concern. Harold's hand found the small of Iyana's back, a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by the assembled family members. Iyana and Harold wanted to focus on the people who are part of our daily lives now, our book club friends, the community members who've watched our relationship develop, the people who've shared our journey. Of course, Dolores said, though her tone suggested mild disapproval. Though I do hope you've considered the practical aspects of this union, financial arrangements, healthcare decisions, that sort of thing. At our age, romance is lovely, but practicality matters, too. The comment hung in the air like a small poison, transforming their love story into a business transaction. Iyana felt the familiar sensation of being reduced to a collection of concerns and complications rather than a woman capable of making informed decisions about her own life. David stepped closer to his aunt, his voice carrying quiet firmness. I think Aunt Iyana and Harold are perfectly capable of handling their own affairs, Mother. Something flickered across Dolores's face, surprise at being corrected by her son, followed by a quick calculation about how to respond without appearing unreasonable. She settled on wounded confusion. I'm simply concerned for everyone's well-being, David. That's what family does. As they returned to the dining room, Iyana caught her self-reflection in the chapel's antique mirror. The woman looking back appeared small, uncertain, overwhelmed by the weight of other people's expectations and concerns. This was the face she wore in family gatherings, the face of someone grateful for attention, but apologetic for requiring it. Tomorrow's wedding dress waited in her closet, a symbol of transformation and hope. It was a vintage gown from the 1950s, elegant cream silk with delicate beadwork that caught the light like scattered stars. She had found it in a consignment shop and fallen in love with its timeless beauty, its suggestion that romance could bloom at any season of life. But under her family's scrutiny, even that choice felt suddenly questionable. Was it appropriate for a woman her age? Would people think I was trying too hard, grasping for youth that was long gone? The questions multiplied like weeds, choking out the joy she had felt when Harold first saw her in the dress, and his eyes had filled with tears of appreciation. As the evening progressed, Iyana found herself retreating into the observer role she had perfected over decades of family gatherings. She watched Dolores hold court, Margaret bask in reflected glory, and David navigate the complex currents of family loyalty and personal integrity. She smiled at the right moments, laughed at Dolores' stories about the grandchildren, accepted compliments about her wedding plans with appropriate gratitude. But beneath the performance, something else was stirring. A quiet recognition that tomorrow would mark more than just a marriage ceremony. It would be a declaration that she was capable of choosing happiness despite a lifetime of being told that her choices were somehow insufficient, her dreams somehow smaller than they should be, her right to joy somehow contingent on other people's approval. The wedding dress hanging in her closet represented more than fashion. It was armor for a battle she was only beginning to understand she had been fighting her entire life. The pre-wedding gathering had taken on the festive atmosphere that Dolores orchestrated so effortlessly, with family members clustered around small tables in the community center's main dining room. White tablecloths and flickering candles created an intimate setting, though Iyana couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching her own celebration from a great distance. Harold had been seated between Margaret's teenage grandson and Dolores's middle son, Michael, who had driven up from New York specifically for the wedding. The conversation flowed around topics that seemed designed to test Harold's worthiness: his retirement pension, his late wife's illness, his daughter's divorce. Each question carried the weight of family vetting, as if love at their age required a different kind of approval process. So, Professor, Mother tells me you were at Harvard for 30 years. That must have been quite a pension package. Harold's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and Iyana felt her stomach tighten. The question was delivered with a smile, but its implications hung in the air like smoke. I was fortunate to have stable employment, though I think Iyana might be disappointed to learn that she's not marrying me for my money. The gentle humor deflected the question while making its inappropriateness clear, but I could see the small muscle working in Harold's jaw. He was a man who had earned respect through decades of scholarship and teaching, and being reduced to a financial profile clearly stung. "Oh, Harold," Dolores laughed from the head of the table, her voice carrying just enough volume to draw everyone's attention. "Michael doesn't mean anything by it. We're all just so protective of our Iyana. She's been alone for so long. We want to make sure she's making good decisions." The words wrapped concern around condescension so skillfully that objecting would seem churlish. Iyana found herself nodding along, playing the role of the grateful sister who appreciated such devoted family oversight. But beneath the table, her hands had clenched into fists. David cleared his throat from across the table. "I think we can trust Iyana's judgment. She's been making good decisions for 83 years. "Of course," Margaret said, though her smile carried a hint of impatience at her brother's continued tendency to challenge the family narrative. "We're simply invested in her happiness." Rose Chen appeared at Iyana's elbow, coffee, a welcome interruption. "Mrs. Swift, would you like to say a few words about tomorrow? I know everyone would love to hear from the bride." Standing felt like stepping onto a stage where she hadn't learned her lines. Iyana looked around the table at faces that reflected various degrees of expectation, affection, and barely concealed skepticism. These were the people who were supposed to celebrate her happiness, yet she felt like she was defending a thesis rather than sharing joy. "I want to thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steadier than she'd expected.
I should let you get your rest," Harold said softly, kissing her forehead with the tenderness that still surprised her every time. "Tomorrow, we start our life together. Really together. Not as an audience for other people's opinions about our choices." After he left, Iyana stood in her small living room looking at the wedding dress hanging on the closet door. In the soft lamplight, the cream silk seemed to glow, the delicate beadwork catching fragments of light like captured stars. She had found the dress at an estate sale, and the elderly woman selling it had told her it belonged to her mother, who had worn it to her second wedding in 1952. "She was 71, the woman had said with a smile. "Said she was too old for white, but too happy for anything else." Iyana touched the fabric gently, remembering how Harold's eyes had filled with tears when she first showed it to him. "You look like someone who believes in magic," he had whispered. But tonight, after hours of subtle undermining disguised as family concern, the dress felt like evidence of foolishness rather than hope. Was she really too old for such romantic gestures? Was she embarrassing herself by believing that love could bloom in the final chapters of life? A soft knock interrupted her brooding. She opened the door to find Emily Rodriguez holding 2 cups of chamomile tea. "Thought you might need some company," Emily said, settling into the comfortable chair by the window. "Pre-wedding nerves are normal at any age." "Is that what this is?" Iyana asked, accepting the warm cup gratefully. Emily studied her with the keen perception of someone who had spent decades reading between the lines of what people said versus what they meant. "What did they do to you tonight?" The question was so direct, so knowing, that Iyana felt tears prick her eyes. "Nothing. They were perfectly lovely. They're just concerned about—" "Bullshit," Emily said calmly, her therapist's vocabulary apparently unrestricted by retirement. "I've been watching family dynamics in this community for 20 years. I know emotional sabotage when I see it." The blunt assessment cut through the fog of confusion that had been building all evening. "They make me feel like I'm asking for too much. Like happiness at my age is somehow inappropriate."
And what do you think? The question forced Iyana to examine beliefs she had never quite articulated. I think I've spent my entire life being grateful for crumbs and calling it a feast. I've accepted being overlooked and called it family harmony. And I think I'm terrified that they might be right, that I'm too old, too set in my ways, too used to being alone to deserve what Harold is offering. Emily leaned forward, her expression carrying the intensity of someone delivering a crucial truth. Iyana, listen to me carefully. You are not too anything to deserve love. You are not required to shrink yourself to make other people comfortable with your choices. And you are not obligated to live your remaining years as a cautionary tale about the dangers of hoping for too much. The words hit like a revelation, exposing the fundamental lie that had governed her relationship with her family for decades. She had been performing diminishment, accepting less than she deserved, and calling it family harmony. Tomorrow, Emily continued, you're going to put on that beautiful dress and marry a man who sees your worth. And if your family can't celebrate that, the problem isn't with your choice. It's with their inability to recognize how remarkable you are. After Emily left, Iyana sat in her quiet apartment looking at the wedding dress. For the first time all evening, she allowed herself to remember how she felt when Harold first took her hand during a particularly heated book club discussion about Virginia Woolf. The jolt of recognition, the sense of being seen and understood, the gradual awakening of feelings she had thought were lost forever. Tomorrow's dress represented more than fashion. It was a declaration of her right to joy, her refusal to accept that love had an expiration date, her decision to stop apologizing for wanting more than survival. But as she prepared for bed, Iyana couldn't shake the feeling that her sister's silence during the evening's conversations had been more ominous than her usual performance of concern. Dolores had watched everything with the calculating attention of someone gathering intelligence, and that realization sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the autumn weather outside her window. Iyana woke to silence, so complete it felt ominous. No birds singing outside her window, no gentle hum of the heating system, no familiar sounds of residents beginning their morning routines. For a moment, disorientation clouded her thoughts. Then reality crashed back with devastating clarity. Her wedding dress lay in tatters across her bedroom floor. The cream silk that had shimmered like moonlight the night before was now a chaos of torn fabric and scattered beads. Someone had taken scissors to the delicate material, cutting through the bodice, shredding the skirt, destroying months of careful alterations. The vintage beadwork that caught light like captured stars now lay scattered across the hardwood like broken dreams. She had found the dress at an estate sale, and the elderly woman selling it had told her it belonged to her mother, who had worn it to her second wedding in 1952. She was 71, the woman had said with a smile, said she was too old for white, but too happy for anything else. Iyana touched the fabric gently, remembering how Harold's eyes had filled with tears when she first showed it to him. "You look like someone who believes in magic." "Who would do this?" Harold said softly, holding the coffee he'd brought for their traditional morning ritual. The cup slipped from his fingers, shattering against the floor and sending coffee splashing across the destroyed silk. "Who would do this?" he whispered, though they both knew. There was only one person who had the access, the motive, and the capacity for such calculated cruelty. Iyana didn't answer. She couldn't speak past the rage building in her chest. Not the hot, explosive anger of a moment, but the cold, calculating fury of a lifetime's worth of suppressed resentment finally finding its target. This wasn't just about a dress. This was about 70 years of being diminished, overlooked, and taught to be grateful for the crumbs of affection her family occasionally offered. As Harold called the front desk to report the break-in, Iyana moved with mechanical precision to her bedroom closet. Behind the winter coats, past the boxes of books she'd saved from her teaching days, her fingers found what she was looking for: a small metal filing box she hadn't opened in 20 years. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, were 3 black and white photographs and a letter written on hotel stationery, evidence of a secret she'd carried for 60 years, evidence that could destroy the foundation of everything Dolores had built her identity upon. The photographs showed Robert Montgomery in an intimate embrace with a woman who was decidedly not his wife. The hotel stationery letter, written in Robert's distinctive handwriting, spoke of love and promises to leave his family for a secretary 20 years his junior, all dated August 1964, when Dolores was pregnant with David and believing herself blessed with the perfect marriage. Iyana had been 23 then, working her first job as a research librarian, attending a conference in the same Philadelphia hotel where Robert was conducting what he'd told his family was a business meeting. She'd seen him in the lobby restaurant, had watched the intimate dinner, had followed them with the instincts as someone who understood that knowledge was power, even if she'd never intended to use it. For 60 years, she'd kept the secret. Through Robert's promotion to company president, through Dolores's smug lectures about choosing the right husband, through family gatherings where her sister held court as the example of successful wifehood. She'd watched Dolores build a mythology around her perfect marriage, watched the family elevate Robert to near sainthood after his death, watched Margaret name her son Robert in honor of his exceptional character. All of it built on a lie that Iyana could have exposed at any time. Harold found her sitting on the bed, holding the photographs with hands that no longer trembled. His face went pale as he recognized what he was seeing. "Iyana, don't do this, please. This won't bring your dress back and it won't make you feel better." She looked at him with eyes that had gone cold and calculating. "Won't it? She destroyed the symbol of my happiness."
Then came the moment Iyana had been both dreading and anticipating for 60 years. The moment when Dolores turned toward the building and looked up, her gaze finding Iyana's window with laser precision. Even from 4 stories up, the fury in her sister's eyes was unmistakable. "She knows I'm the one who told them," Iyana said quietly. Within minutes, the elevator dinged on their floor, followed by the sound of multiple footsteps moving rapidly down the hallway. The knock on Iyana's door carried the authority of people who had moved past asking permission. Harold opened the door to find the entire Montgomery family clustered in the hallway, their faces reflecting various stages of grief, anger, and betrayal. Dolores pushed past Harold without ceremony, her careful composure completely abandoned. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice carrying a venom that made Harold step protectively closer to Iyana. "How dare you destroy my family with lies and fabrications just because you're jealous of—" "Stop." David's voice cut through his mother's tirade with surprising authority. "Just stop, Mother. We've all seen the photographs. We've heard about the letters. This isn't about lies." Margaret stood in the doorway, her mascara smeared and her perfect hair disheveled. "Aunt Iyana, why would you do this? Why would you destroy Daddy's memory? Why would you hurt us like this?" "Hurt you?" Iyana's voice carried a steadiness that surprised everyone, including herself. "I kept your father's secret for 60 years, while your mother used his supposed perfection as a weapon against anyone who dared to be happy. I protected your family's mythology while being told repeatedly that my own happiness was somehow inappropriate, somehow too much to ask for." She gestured toward the destroyed wedding dress, which still lay in tatters across her bedroom floor.
Your mother couldn't bear to see me have one day of joy, so she destroyed the symbol of my happiness. She took scissors to my wedding dress because the idea of me being celebrated, of me being the center of attention for one afternoon, was unbearable to her. Dolores's face had gone pale, but her voice remained defiant. I don't know what you're talking about. I would never... I saw you leaving Aunt Iyana's room last night. I was doing my final rounds at 11:30, and I saw you coming out of this apartment with something in your hands. When I checked this morning after Harold called about the break-in, I found fabric scissors in the utility closet down the hall, the same scissors that were missing from the activities room yesterday. The silence that followed was deafening. Dolores opened her mouth, then closed it again, her usual arsenal of deflection and manipulation suddenly useless in the face of concrete evidence. Michael stepped forward, his business training taking over in the crisis. Mother, is this true? Did you destroy Aunt Iyana's wedding dress? Dolores looked around the room like a trapped animal, her gaze finding no allies, no escape route from the truth that was closing in around her. Her carefully constructed facade cracked, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. Because she was never supposed to be the one who got the fairy tale. She was supposed to be grateful for what little attention she got. She was supposed to understand that some people are meant to shine, and others are meant to stand in the shadows. The confession hung in the air like a physical blow, its honesty more devastating than any lie could have been. In that moment, everyone in the room understood that they weren't just dealing with a moment of jealous sabotage. They were confronting a worldview that had poisoned generations of family relationships. Harold's arm tightened around Iyana's as she absorbed the full weight of her sister's admission. 70 years of being made to feel grateful for crumbs, of having her happiness questioned and her choices dismissed, of being taught that wanting more than survival was somehow selfish. All of it had been deliberate. The wedding was supposed to happen in 6 hours. Instead, the Swift family was finally having the conversation they should have had decades ago, with the wreckage of secrets and lies scattered around them like the remains of Iyana's destroyed wedding dress. 3 days after the revelation, Sunset Manor had become ground zero for a family crisis that seemed to expand with each passing hour. What had begun as Iyana's calculated revenge had metastasized into something that touched every corner of the Montgomery family tree, reaching back through decades of carefully constructed narratives and forward into the next generation's understanding of their own history. Margaret hadn't returned to work. She sat in her mother's apartment, surrounded by photo albums and family documents, as if she could somehow excavate the truth from 60 years of curated memories. Her husband, Tom, had driven up from Newton, ostensibly to provide support, but really to assess the damage to their own marriage. If Robert Montgomery could maintain a perfect facade while betraying his pregnant wife, what did that say about other seemingly solid unions? I keep thinking about all the times I told people about my parents' perfect marriage, all the times I used Dad as an example of integrity, of commitment. God, I named my son after him. David sat across from his sister in their mother's living room, noting how different the space felt now that its foundation had shifted. The photographs of Robert, that had once seemed like shrines to a beloved patriarch, now felt like evidence of a massive deception. We can't change what he did, Maggie, but we can decide how to move forward. How? Margaret's voice cracked. How do I tell my children that their grandfather wasn't the man we taught them to revere? How do I face my clients when half my business comes from referrals who trust the Montgomery name because of Dad's reputation? Down the hall, Dolores had retreated into a silence that was more unsettling than her usual dramatics. She sat by her window, still impeccably dressed but somehow diminished, as if the revelation had literally shrunk her. Emily Rodriguez had tried to visit, offering the kind of therapeutic support she'd provided to countless residents over the years, but Dolores refused to see anyone except her children. She's not eating, Rose Chen reported to David during one of their hallway conferences. The dining staff says she came down yesterday but left without touching her food when other residents started looking at her. The community itself had divided into factions with the precision of a political scandal. Some residents, particularly the women who had felt dismissed or overlooked by Dolores's queenly behavior, expressed quiet satisfaction at seeing her brought low. Others, especially those who had enjoyed basking in her reflected status, treated Iyana with the cold disapproval reserved for people who violated unspoken social contracts. "It's like watching a 60-year marriage dissolve in real time," observed Dr. Patricia Williams, Sunset Manor's resident psychologist, during her weekly coffee with Rose Chen. Dolores built her entire identity around being the superior sister, the perfect wife, the family matriarch. Take that away, and who is she? The question wasn't rhetorical. For 3 days, Dolores had been grappling with exactly that identity crisis, while her family struggled to rebuild their understanding of their own history. Harold had moved into Iyana's apartment temporarily, sleeping on her couch while she processed the aftermath of her revelation. Their wedding had been quietly postponed, not canceled, as Harold was careful to emphasize, but delayed until the immediate crisis passed. He watched his fiancée with the concerned attention of someone who recognized that victory could be as traumatic as defeat. "Do you regret it?" he asked on the third morning as they sat with their coffee, surrounded by the remains of the wedding dress that had started everything. Iyana considered the question with the thoroughness it deserved. "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that Dolores couldn't find it in herself to celebrate my happiness without destroying it. But do I regret finally telling the truth?" She shook her head. "No, I should have done it decades ago."
Even knowing what it's cost? What has it cost really? Margaret is devastated, but she's also finally free from the impossible standard of her father's supposed perfection. Michael is angry, but he's also starting to understand why his relationships have always felt shallow. He's been chasing an ideal that never existed. David... She paused, considering her youngest nephew. David seems relieved, actually, like he finally has permission to see his family clearly. Emily knocked and entered without waiting for an invitation, a privilege earned through 20 years of friendship. She carried a thermos of tea and the expression of someone bearing news. "I just came from the dining room," she announced, settling into the chair that had become her unofficial throne during the crisis. "The grandchildren are here." Through the window, they could see a convoy of cars in the parking lot, young adults who had driven from Boston, New York, and Philadelphia to demand answers about the family mythology that had suddenly crumbled beneath them. Margaret's children, Michael's daughters, David's college-age son from his first marriage. The third generation, who had been raised on stories of their grandfather's exceptional character and their grandmother's perfect marriage. "How much do they know?" Harold asked. "Everything, according to Rose. Margaret called them all yesterday and told them the whole story. They're here to confront Dolores directly." Iyana felt a stab of something that might have been regret. She had imagined her revelation affecting her immediate family, but she hadn't fully considered how it would ripple out to young people who had built their understanding of love, commitment, and family honor around a lie. "Rebecca is the angriest," Emily continued, referring to Margaret's 25-year-old daughter. "She broke up with her boyfriend last year because he reminded her too much of her grandfather, reliable, successful, family-oriented. Turns out she was running from exactly the kind of man she thought she wanted." The irony was sharp enough to cut. Robert's infidelity, hidden for 60 years, was still shaping romantic choices in the next generation. How many family decisions had been made using his marriage as a template? How many relationships had been judged against a standard that was fundamentally false? "And young Robert?" Iyana asked, referring to Margaret's son who carried his grandfather's name. "He's talking about changing it, says he doesn't want to carry the name of a cheater." Emily's expression suggested this was just the beginning of the identity reckonings that would follow. A commotion in the hallway interrupted their conversation, raised voices, the sound of multiple people trying to talk at once. Through her door, Iyana could hear Margaret attempting to manage her children's anger, while David tried to maintain some semblance of order. "We should go down there," Harold suggested, but Iyana shook her head. "This is their crisis to navigate. I've done enough." But even as she said it, Iyana could hear the pain in her great-niece's voice, the confusion of a young woman whose foundational beliefs about family and love had been shattered.
Rebecca had been planning her own wedding before the breakup, dreaming of the kind of lasting partnership her grandparents had supposedly modeled. "Maybe I should talk to them," Iyana said quietly. "Explain why I kept the secret for so long, why I finally decided to tell it." Emily studied her friend with the keen perception of someone who had spent decades helping people navigate emotional crises. "Are you prepared for the possibility that they won't forgive you? That some of them will blame you for destroying their sense of family identity?" The question forced Iyana to confront the full scope of what she had set in motion. It was one thing to shatter Dolores's carefully constructed superiority, another entirely to destabilize the foundational beliefs of young people who had never done anything except trust the stories they had been told. "I'm prepared," she said finally, "because the alternative was watching them build their own lives on the same foundation of lies that poisoned mine and Dolores's relationship. Better they know the truth now and build something real than discover it decades from now when it's too late to change course." Harold reached for her hand, his touch anchoring her to the present moment and the choice they had made to build their own relationship on honesty rather than illusion. "Whatever happens next, we face it together." Through the window, they could see the family gathering on the community's back patio, 3 generations trying to make sense of a legacy that had suddenly revealed itself to be built on deception. The conversation would be difficult, probably painful, possibly destructive. But it would also be honest in a way that the Swift family had avoided for 60 decades. Iyana stood, smoothing her sweater with the same careful precision she had once used to arrange books in the library. "I think it's time I met with my great-nieces and great-nephews. They deserve to hear the truth from the person who kept it secret for so long." As she prepared to face the young people whose world she had helped to destroy and potentially rebuild, Iyana reflected on the weight of secrets and the price of truth. She had spent 60 years protecting a lie that ultimately protected no one, and 3 days learning that honesty, however painful, might be the only foundation strong enough to support authentic relationships. The wedding dress still lay in pieces on her bedroom floor, but the marriage that it was meant to celebrate remained intact, waiting for a moment when joy could coexist with truth. A week after the canceled wedding, the full scope of the damage had become impossible to ignore. Sunset Manor felt like a town divided by civil war, with residents choosing sides and whispered conversations stopping abruptly when either Iyana or Dolores appeared. The family crisis had become community entertainment, transforming what should have been a private reckoning into a public spectacle. Dolores had stopped leaving her apartment entirely. Meals went untouched outside her door, and even Rose Chen's gentle attempts at wellness checks were met with silence. The woman who had once commanded every room she entered now seemed to be disappearing entirely, as if the revelation had literally diminished her physical presence. "She's not answering her phone," Margaret told David, during one of their daily strategy sessions in the community center's small conference room. "I'm worried about her mental state. She built her entire identity around being the perfect wife and mother. Take that away?" David nodded grimly. As a counselor, he recognized the signs of someone whose foundational sense of self had been completely destabilized. The grandchildren aren't helping. Rebecca's ultimatum about choosing between supporting you or supporting Aunt Iyana isn't exactly conducive to healing. The 3rd generation had indeed drawn battle lines with the clarity of youth. Rebecca and her cousins had aligned themselves firmly with their parents, viewing Iyana's revelation as a betrayal that demanded consequences. Young Robert had followed through on his threat to legally change his name, filing paperwork to become Robert Swift instead of Robert Montgomery. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. He was choosing to align himself with truth over family mythology, even if that truth was painful. "Maybe we should have kept the secret," Margaret said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe some truths are too destructive to tell." "Would you want Tom to keep that kind of secret from you?" David asked quietly.
I knew he worked late too often, traveled more than necessary, came home with guilt gifts that had nothing to do with birthdays or anniversaries. Dolores's voice carried the weight of admissions she had never made to anyone, possibly including herself. I chose not to know because knowing would have required doing something about it. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither sister had expected to find. Iyana felt something shift in her understanding of the last 60 years. Dolores hadn't been the naive victim of a carefully hidden secret, but a willing participant in maintaining a fiction that served them both in different ways. Why? Iyana asked. Because leaving would have meant admitting failure. Because staying meant I could be the perfect wife with the successful husband. Because... Dolores paused, her voice becoming smaller. Because I was pregnant with David and terrified of being a single mother in 1964. The human complexity of the situation began to emerge from beneath decades of judgment and resentment. Dolores hadn't been maintaining a lie out of ignorance or malice, but out of fear and the limited options available to women of her generation. And later, after the children were grown? Later, the lie had become the foundation of everything. My status in the community, my children's pride in their father, my own sense of self-worth. Taking it away would have meant admitting I'd wasted my entire adult life living a fiction. Iyana sat back in her chair, absorbing the implications of this revelation. Her sister hadn't been the confident, superior woman she had appeared to be, but someone as trapped by circumstances and choices as Iyana herself had been. "I'm sorry I destroyed your wedding dress," Dolores said quietly. "I'm sorry I spent 70 years making you feel small so I could feel bigger. I'm sorry I couldn't bear to see you happy because it highlighted how miserable I was." The apology landed with unexpected force, cutting through decades of accumulated hurt to reach something Iyana had thought was permanently damaged. "I'm sorry I used your secret as a weapon instead of offering it as truth you deserve to hear." They sat in silence, two elderly women finally seeing each other clearly after a lifetime of performing roles that had never quite fit. The damage was done. Families were divided, reputations were destroyed. Young people were questioning everything they'd been taught about love and commitment. But in the wreckage, something that might eventually become understanding was beginning to take root. "What happens now?" Dolores asked. "I don't know," Iyana admitted. "But I think we stop pretending we're characters in other people's stories and start figuring out who we actually are." 2 weeks after the revelation, fate intervened in the form of a malfunctioning storage room door in the community center. Iyana had gone to retrieve decorations for Harold's upcoming birthday celebration, a quiet affair they'd planned to replace the wedding festivities that had been consumed by family chaos. Dolores had arrived separately, seeking the solitude of organizing old craft supplies, a task that required no interaction with other residents. The heavy door clicked shut behind them, with the finality of a vault ceiling. The electronic lock, recently installed as a security measure, had engaged automatically. They were trapped together in a space barely larger than a walk-in closet, surrounded by boxes of Christmas ornaments and forgotten art projects from residents who had since passed away. "The cleaning staff won't be here until morning," Dolores observed, her voice carrying an odd calmness. She settled onto an overturned crate with the dignity of someone who had learned to find composure even in indignified circumstances. Iyana tested the door handle uselessly, then joined her sister among the storage boxes. The small space forced proximity they had avoided for 2 weeks, sitting close enough to see the fine lines around each other's eyes, the slight tremor in hands that once had seemed so steady. "I've been thinking about Mother," Dolores said unexpectedly. Their mother had died 15 years earlier, taking with her the unspoken rules that had governed the sisters' relationship. Margaret Swift had been a woman of rigid expectations, who had taught her daughters that love was conditional on performance, that approval was earned through comparison, and that there was only enough affection for one daughter to truly shine. "She would have hated this," Iyana replied. "The mess, the public nature of it, the way the family's falling apart." "She would have blamed you for speaking up." Dolores's voice held no accusation, just weary recognition of their mother's patterns. "Remember when I broke her china cup and you got punished because you should have been watching me more carefully?" The memory surfaced with surprising clarity. Dolores at 7, tears streaming down her face, as their mother bandaged a small cut on her finger while lecturing 9-year-old Iyana about responsibility and protecting her younger sister. Even then, Dolores's accidents had somehow become Iyana's failures.
I spent my whole childhood trying to keep you from getting hurt, Iyana said slowly. And you spent yours learning that someone else would always take responsibility for your mistakes. Dolores was quiet for a moment, processing this observation about their family dynamics with the perspective that only comes from decades of distance. I never thought about it that way. I just knew that when things went wrong, you would somehow make them right again. When Mother was angry, you would absorb it. When I needed something, you would provide it. And I learned that my job was to be invisible unless someone needed something from me. Iyana touched one of the storage boxes, running her fingers along its dusty surface. I became so good at anticipating other people's needs that I forgot I was allowed to have my own. But you resented me for it. I resented the system that made it necessary. I resented Mother for teaching us that love was scarce, that one of us had to diminish so the other could shine. I resented Father for being too weak to protect either of us from that dynamic. And yes, I resented you for accepting the benefits of that system without questioning whether it was fair. Dolores absorbed this with the stillness of someone finally hearing a truth they had long suspected but never acknowledged. Robert's airfare wasn't the first time I chose not to know something that would require me to act. I've spent my entire life avoiding information that would complicate the narrative I wanted to believe. What do you mean? I knew you were lonely after Gerald died. I knew you struggled with depression, with feeling useless. I knew Harold made you happy in a way you'd never experienced before. Dolores's voice became smaller, more honest. And I couldn't stand it because it highlighted how empty my own marriage had been, how much of my life I'd spent performing happiness instead of feeling it. The admission hung between them in the dusty air, more intimate than any conversation they'd had in decades. Iyana felt something shift in her understanding of her sister, seeing not the confident woman who had dominated every family gathering, but someone who was as trapped by circumstances and choices as Iyana herself had been. The wedding dress. You didn't destroy it because you thought I was making a fool of myself. You destroyed it because you couldn't bear to see me have what you never had. Authentic joy. Real partnership based on choice rather than necessity or social expectation. The courage to be vulnerable at 83 instead of maintaining the same defensive facade I've worn since I was 23. They sat in silence as afternoon light filtered through the small window near the ceiling, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits around their heads. The storage room had become a confessional. The enforced proximity created space for honesty that might never have emerged in any other setting. I don't know how to forgive you for 60 years of cruelty, Iyana said finally, and I don't know how to forgive myself for enabling it by never fighting back until I had a weapon that could destroy everything. Maybe forgiveness isn't the right goal. Maybe understanding is enough. Maybe recognizing that we were both victims of a system that pitted us against each other instead of teaching us to support each other. The conversation continued as shadows lengthened across the floor, two elderly women finally dismantling the mythology that had governed their relationship for 70 years. They talked about their father's emotional absence, their mother's conditional love, the pressure to compete rather than collaborate. They examined how those early patterns had shaped their marriages, their parenting, their ability to form authentic relationships. When Rose Chen finally found them the next morning, alerted by Harold's concern about Iyana's absence, she discovered two women who looked exhausted, but somehow lighter, as if they had finally set down burdens they had carried for too long.
In the aftermath of their storage room confrontation, both sisters retreated to consider their options, with the careful deliberation of people who had finally seen themselves clearly. The community watched with the fascination reserved for natural disasters, terrible to witness but impossible to ignore. Some residents had begun taking sides, like spectators at a sporting event, while others quietly went about their routines, understanding that family dramas eventually resolve themselves one way or another. David had emerged as the family's unofficial mediator, taking indefinite leave from his counseling practice to manage what he privately thought of as the most complex therapeutic situation of his career. His own family relationships had become his laboratory, forcing him to apply professional skills to personal wounds that ran deeper than anything he'd encountered in his office. "We need to make a decision about moving forward," he told Margaret during one of their daily strategy sessions. "The grandchildren are taking this harder than anyone anticipated, and Mother isn't eating enough to keep a sparrow alive." Margaret looked exhausted, her usually perfect appearance disheveled from weeks of crisis management. Her real estate business had suffered as she struggled to focus on anything beyond the family implosion. "What kind of decision? We can't change what happened. We can't unknow what Aunt Iyana told us." "No, but we can decide whether this destroys us or teaches us something about building healthier relationships going forward." David paused, choosing his words carefully. "Rebecca called this morning. She wants to disinvite Aunt Iyana from her wedding next year. Says she can't stand the thought of having someone who destroys families at her celebration of love." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Rebecca's wedding was supposed to represent the next generation's ability to learn from their elders' mistakes, but instead it had become another battleground for conflicts that predated her birth. Harold had been watching Iyana withdraw into herself with the concerned attention of someone who recognized depression when he saw it. Their morning coffee ritual had become strained, filled with silences that spoke to guilt and regret, rather than comfortable companionship. He understood that revenge, even justified revenge, often poisoned the person seeking it as much as their target. "I've been thinking about our wedding," he said during their Tuesday morning walk around the community gardens. "Not the big celebration we planned, but something simpler, something that focuses on us rather than family dynamics." Iyana stopped walking, turning to face him with an expression that mixed hope and skepticism. "You still want to marry me? After everything I've done? After seeing how destructive I can be when I'm angry? I want to marry the woman who kept a terrible secret for 60 years to protect her family, even when that family didn't protect her. I want to marry the woman who finally told the truth when the lies became unbearable. I want to marry someone who's human enough to make mistakes and strong enough to face the consequences." His words carried the weight of someone who had thought carefully about what he was choosing. Harold had been married before, had navigated the complexities of long-term partnership, and understood that love required accepting someone's capacity for both kindness and cruelty. Emily Rodriguez had been conducting her own form of family therapy, having separate conversations with both sisters about the choice between holding on to resentment or finding peace. Her background as a therapist, combined with her outsider's perspective on the Swift family dynamics, made her uniquely qualified to help them navigate the aftermath of their mutual destruction. "The question isn't whether you can forgive each other," she told Iyana during one of their evening tea sessions. "The question is whether you can forgive yourselves for the roles you played in this family drama." "I destroyed everything she built her life around," Iyana replied, her voice soft. "How do I forgive myself for that level of cruelty?" "By recognizing that what she built was already destroying both of you. By understanding that sometimes truth has to be destructive before it can be healing." A crisis arrived on Thursday morning in the form of an ambulance in Sunset Manor's circular driveway. Dolores had collapsed in her apartment bathroom, the result of dehydration and stress-induced exhaustion, rather than any dramatic medical emergency. But the sight of her sister being wheeled out on a stretcher triggered something fundamental in Iyana. She rode to the hospital in Harold's car, her hands shaking as she called David to update him on his mother's condition. The emergency room waiting area became another family gathering place, but this time the dynamics had shifted. Margaret sat beside Iyana rather than across from her, and David held his aunt's hand while they waited for updates from the medical staff. "She's been punishing herself,"
refusing to eat, barely sleeping, sitting in that apartment replaying 60 years of marriage and wondering what was real and what was performance. Dr. Sandra Kim emerged from the treatment area with the brisk efficiency of someone delivering routine news. She's dehydrated and exhausted, but she's stable. We're keeping her overnight for observation, but she should be fine with proper rest and nutrition. Can we see her? David asked. Family only, and just one at a time for now. She's awake, but fragile. Iyana found herself standing outside Dolores' hospital room, uncertain whether her presence would provide comfort or cause additional stress. Through the window, she could see her sister looking smaller than ever against the white hospital sheets, her carefully maintained facade completely abandoned. Go in, Margaret urged. She asked for you specifically. Dolores turned toward the door when Iyana entered, her eyes carrying a vulnerability that had been absent for decades. The hospital gown and lack of makeup had stripped away the armor she usually wore, revealing someone who looked every one of her 79 years. I thought I was dying, and all I could think about was how I wasted our entire lives hating each other over things that happened when we were children. Iyana pulled the visitor's chair closer to the bed, noting how fragile her hands looked against the white blanket. You're not dying. Dr. Kim says you just need to take better care of yourself. That's the problem. I don't know how to take care of myself when I'm not performing for other people. I don't know who I am when I'm not the perfect wife, the devoted mother, the successful sister. Dolores's voice carried the bewilderment of someone whose identity had been completely destabilized. You took away my role, and I don't know what's left. The admission cut deeper than any accusation could have. Iyana realized that her revelation hadn't just exposed Robert's infidelity, it had forced Dolores to confront the possibility that her entire adult life had been an elaborate performance with no authentic self underneath. What's left is a woman who raised 3 children, built a social network, survived 60 years of marriage to a difficult man, and had the strength to maintain her dignity even when her world collapsed. Iyana paused, considering her next words carefully. What's left is my sister, who I've missed terribly even when I was angry with her. Dolores turned toward the window, tears falling silently down her cheeks. I don't know how to be your sister. I only know how to be your competition. Then we learn together. We figure out how to be 2 elderly women who have more in common than we ever admitted, who have limited time left to build something real instead of something performative. The conversation continued as afternoon light shifted across the hospital room floor, 2 sisters finally having the relationship they might have had if their parents had taught them to support each other instead of compete. They talked about Dolores's fears of irrelevance, Iyana's decades of loneliness, and the possibility that understanding might be the foundation for something that resembled friendship. When visiting hours ended, Iyana kissed her sister's forehead with genuine affection for the first time in memory. Harold and I are getting married next month. Small ceremony, just close friends. I'd like you to be there, if you're willing. Dolores squeezed her hand with surprising strength. I'd be honored. And Iyana, I hope you'll wear something beautiful, something that makes you feel as radiant as you looked in that dress I destroyed. Walking out of the hospital with Harold and the rest of the family, Iyana felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks, the possibility that destruction could be followed by reconstruction, that truth could ultimately be more stable than lies, and that choosing forgiveness might be the most radical act of all. 3 months later, spring had arrived at Sunset Manor with the gentle persistence of hope after a long winter. The community gardens were blooming with daffodils and early tulips, their bright colors a cheerful contrast to the subdued atmosphere that had lingered since the Swift family crisis. But today, the mood was different, anticipatory rather than tense, celebratory rather than divided. Iyana stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of her navy blue dress, the same one she had worn to the rehearsal dinner that felt like a lifetime ago. Harold had insisted she didn't need a new dress, that she looked beautiful in whatever she chose to wear. But Emily had surprised her with a small corsage of white roses, and Rose Chen had lent her a delicate pearl bracelet that caught the afternoon light perfectly. "You look radiant," Harold said from the doorway, his voice carrying the same gentle warmth that had first drawn him to him near.
Through her window, Iyana could see the small gathering assembled in the community garden's gazebo. 20 people, perhaps 25. Harold's daughter Sarah, who had flown in from Oregon, their book club friends, several residents who had become genuine supporters over the past months, David and his new girlfriend who worked as a nurse at the local hospital. Margaret had come alone, her divorce from Tom having been finalized the previous month. Not because of her father's infidelity, but because learning the truth had given her permission to acknowledge problems that had existed for years. Dolores sat in the front row, wearing a soft lavender suit that complemented her silver hair. She had lost weight during her health crisis, but the change made her appear refined rather than frail. More importantly, she looked genuinely peaceful for the first time in anyone's memory, like someone who had finally stopped performing and started living. "She's been helping with the flowers," Harold observed, watching through the window as Dolores adjusted the white roses that decorated the gazebo's railings. "Rose Chen says she's volunteered to coordinate the community's spring festival." The transformation had been gradual but unmistakable. Dolores had begun participating in community activities again, but with a humility that was entirely new. She listened more than she spoke, asked questions instead of making pronouncements, and had developed an unexpected friendship with Emily Rodriguez based on their shared interest in helping other residents navigate family conflicts. "The grandchildren?" Iyana asked, though she already knew the answer would be complicated. "Rebecca is still angry. Young Robert Swift sent a card wishing us well. Michael's daughters are coming to the reception." Harold's tone suggested he understood that family healing happened in stages, not dramatic revelations. "It's progress." The ceremony itself was everything their original wedding had been intended to be: intimate, authentic, focused on the love between two people who had found each other in life's final chapters. Pastor Williams from the community's interfaith ministry spoke about second chances and the courage required to remain open to love despite life's disappointments. Harold's vows were simple and profound, promising to honor Iyana's intelligence, to support her independence, and to build with her a partnership based on truth rather than illusion. Iyana's vows were equally straightforward, though they carried the weight of someone who had learned to value authenticity over performance. She promised to bring her whole self to their marriage, including the parts that were capable of both great loyalty and calculated revenge, the woman who could keep secrets for 60 years, and the woman who could destroy a family's mythology with a series of phone calls. "I promise to love you with the honesty I wish I had shown myself decades ago," she concluded, her voice steady as she looked into Harold's eyes. "And I promise to build our life together on the foundation of truth, even when that truth is complicated or painful." When Pastor Williams pronounced them married, the small gathering erupted in applause that felt genuinely joyful rather than politely obligatory. David wiped away tears as he watched his aunt kiss her new husband, understanding that he was witnessing something rare, a love story that had survived family crisis and emerged stronger. The reception was held in the community center's main room, decorated with simple elegance that reflected the couple's preferences rather than anyone else's expectations. Margaret gave a short speech acknowledging the complexity of the past months, while celebrating the possibility of building healthier relationships going forward. Emily toasted the bride's courage in choosing happiness despite the risks involved. Rose Chen shared observations about the power of second chances and the importance of supporting each other's joy rather than competing for limited resources. But it was Dolores who provided the moment that everyone would remember. Rising slowly from her table,
She moved with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to speak from the heart rather than the script. My sister and I have spent 70 years trapped in roles that were too small for either of us. I was supposed to be the perfect sister, the successful one, the example others should follow. Iyana was supposed to be grateful for whatever attention she received, content to live in my shadow, happy with whatever crumbs of affection our family could spare. She paused, looking directly at Iyana with an expression that mixed regret and genuine affection. It took us 8 decades to understand that those roles were prisons, not privileges. That competing with each other meant we both lost the opportunity to have a real relationship. The room was completely silent, residents and family members equally absorbed by this public acknowledgement of truths that had been whispered about for months. Today, I'm not here as the perfect sister, or the family matriarch, or the woman who had everything figured out. I'm here as someone who loves Iyana and wants her to be happy, even if, especially if, that happiness highlights how much of my own life I spent performing rather than living. Dolores raised her glass with hands that trembled slightly but held steady. To Iyana and Harold, may your marriage be built on the kind of honesty that my generation was too frightened to attempt. The toast was echoed throughout the room, but Iyana barely heard it. She was looking at her sister through tears, seeing not the woman who had tormented her for decades, but someone who had found the courage to acknowledge painful truths and choose growth over defensiveness. Later, as the reception wound down and residents began returning to their apartments, the two sisters found themselves alone on the community center's small balcony. The spring evening was warm enough to sit outside, and they settled into chairs overlooking the gardens where they had both spent so many hours avoiding each other. "Do you think Mother would approve?" Dolores asked, though her tone suggested the question was rhetorical. Mother would have found something to criticize about any choice either of us made, but I think she would have been surprised to see us sitting here together, talking honestly instead of performing for each other. They sat in comfortable silence. Two elderly women who had finally learned to see each other as people rather than competitors. The damage from their family crisis would take years to fully heal. Relationships had been permanently altered, trust had been broken and would need to be slowly rebuilt, and some family members might not ever fully forgive the disruption of their carefully constructed narratives. But in the growing darkness of the spring evening, surrounded by the sounds of a community settling into peaceful routines, Iyana felt something she had never experienced before: the satisfaction of being authentically herself, married to someone who loved her for exactly who she was, and finally at peace with the sister who had shared her entire life journey. Harold found them there an hour later, two elderly women in their 70s and 80s, talking quietly about books they had read, places they wanted to visit, and the strange relief of no longer having to pretend to be anyone other than themselves. He settled into a chair beside his new wife, content to listen to conversations that had taken 8 decades to begin. The destroyed wedding dress had long since been disposed of, but the marriage it was meant to celebrate had survived the crisis and emerged stronger. Sometimes the most beautiful foundations were built not on perfect ground, but on the ruins of structures that had never been strong enough to support authentic love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.